So I'd like to ask you to help me to welcome Sam Johnston again. We were chatting a little bit, and I said, you know, she's been introduced now 3 times, so what else can I say about you that we don't already know? So interesting facts about her. She did teach in Russia for a year before coming back and doing her master's and going right into her PhD at Harvard. She's also a busy mom, the 2-year-old and a 7-month-old, so kudos to you for figuring that out and being here. Right? There's a dad at home, I'm sure, that's wondering when's mom coming back. Maybe the kids are wondering when mom's coming back. So Sam is going to share with us today kind of the blended learning classroom model and looking at some new tools that were developed by CAST through some very generous funding from the Gates Foundation. This is going to be more of a workshop than a lecture for an hour, so please ask questions at the end. There'll be lots of time to interact with Sam that we have her here. So we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So yeah, please ask questions throughout. Part of what we want to do is get some feedback on this web resource, and also sort of feedback generally on what you think are the areas of priority for UDL. I do have to say on the 2 little kids front, I was very happy to put clothes on today and know they would not have spit up on them. I was 80% sure they would not. But yes, it is a juggling act, but a wonderful one. I think I have to, do I press the green buttons on, the green mute button? Does it need to be red? It's on, right? Yeah, because I can hear it. Okay, good. So, you know, the point of this session is not to lecture at you like last time, is really to sort of get your feedback. And I apologize that the slides are not in French. My French is rusty. I also apologize for that, but I'm happy if you have questions and you want to ask them in French. If I need some help, I'll just ask for it. Or I can use the headset. But let me go ahead here. So, as we know from last time, CAST is a research and development organization. We do a lot of research in universal design for learning. We also do a lot of applied research, or even what sort of gets CAST as technical assistance, where we're sort of really, I would say some of our work right now in higher ed really is almost like a needs assessment as to what are some of the things cropping up is really critical if universal design for learning is going to have a stronger foothold, and what are some of the areas we can help to potentially impact. So, you know, a lot of the work we've been doing in higher ed over the last few years that's in the area of blended learning, of online learning, has really raised for us the importance of doing more work around the area of assessment and around the area of sort of thinking about, you know, ranging from the assessments that get done when students come right into the system, through to the formative assessments in their courses, through to the summative assessments. How do we start moving the conversation to a place where using a single form of assessment, or even offering different assessments but never as options, sort of, okay, now you get some multiple choice, and then later you're going to get some of this, but you have to do everything. That's definitely better, but it's not where we want to be. So, you know, a lot of our work in higher ed now is helping us see with partners, and we need partners. So I would say, you know, hopefully this is the beginning of a relationship. And, you know, we're looking for what are the real needs. So this work I'll talk about today was a first pass at sort of trying to respond to some of the needs. We, as I mentioned in the earlier session, the United States Department of Labor, the Employment and Training Administration, created a $2 billion investment into trade-adjusted workers. So these were people who were living in towns where all of a sudden the main industry had gone, or cities. Think of a city like Detroit. And you have a great number of people that are ready, willing, able to work, that are all of a sudden needing to reskill are needing to, have different opportunities for work. And because not all of the communities were just trade-adjusted communities, and it's a huge investment, the funding was also opened up to other populations that are often not in higher education or had not been. So these included people who were underemployed, there's a big push to support veterans coming back from military service. A lot of people who are, there's increasingly some research and work being done with students with disabilities, helping them transition from high school to higher ed. But the really fascinating thing about this program for us is not only that there's a UDL requirement that all these TACT grantees, these community colleges, have to use, there's a requirement for them to design their courses and programs collaboratively, so this open education requirement, they've got to openly license these resources, but a single grantee is often 10 colleges working together and having to design a course together. So there's really a lot of things coming up that are interesting for thinking about, at the end of the day, all these changes, how do we make sure that the variability amongst learners has a central role, and our design and our work really fits into that. So this $2 billion investment happened. The Gates Foundation basically said there's a need for technical assistance to help these grantees make sure that they develop very high-quality open education resources. This is the biggest investment in open education resources in the world right now. It's, you think of $2 billion going into curriculum that essentially is going to be free and is going to reduce the cost of textbooks and other things for students, hugely impactful for the barriers around cost to higher ed. Let's make sure those are well designed, because we don't want to put in place other barriers where, we've replaced the $75 textbook with an open education resource, but somebody who has a print disability can't use that resource. So that's where CAST was brought in to help work on that work. So I talked a little earlier about the National STEM Consortium. We collaborated with community colleges, both in an intensive way where we were co-designing with them, and also in a sort of general, how do we provide the kind of resources out there they might need. And then it's called Project Open. It's funded by the Gates Foundation, and then these were the partners that were responsible for delivering Project Open. So it's the Open Learning Initiative at Carnegie Mellon and Stanford, Creative Commons that does all the work around, not all, but a lot of the work around openly licensing. So I would say if you want to know more about open education, I would go to Creative Commons site and just see what some of that is. It might be really a really quick way of just bringing a new teaching innovation back to your environments. And it really does open up sort of a different world, which is very interesting. And helps with some of the copyright issues. Sometimes people are wanting to use things, but it's copyrighted, and what do we do? And then the Washington State Board of Community and Technical Colleges and us at CAST, and our job was really around implementing universal design for learning in this. Obviously our operating principle when we were trying to figure out how do we help these community colleges and get them to help us understand what they need, we operated with, this premise for higher ed that I would say increasingly is just a non-negotiable, is that variability, it's the rule, it's not the exception, and we need to take that as our baseline when we procure technology, when we build institutional policies, when we design courses and programs, when we think about, I have a real interest in students with psychiatric challenges in higher ed. A lot of the policies just around full-time, part-time have a huge impact on their ability to get services. In many cases, the best thing for retention, or the healthiest thing, may be to drop from a full course load down. Very hard if a student has consequences around that. So there are many policies that are institutional policies that actually impact practices in the classroom and things that happen in terms of a student's retention that we also need to think about. But with all those things, we need to think about our range of learners. So just quick graphic of this one again. We're trying to address things around the recognition network, the strategic network, and the affective network. So multiple means of representation, multiple means of action expression, multiple means of engagement, and the relationship about these things. So when we look at the website, which you're more than welcome if you want to go to it now. I'm not remotely offended if people are on their computers. It's udloncampus.cas.org. You're more than welcome to pull that up and browse as we go. And so, we were trying to think, how do we sort of try to get some coverage in each of these areas? And then also do it at more of a systems level as opposed to just targeting faculty or instructional designers. There's a lot of resources specifically for faculty instructional designers, but it's meant to be supportive of system change, which doesn't always happen in one single place. So we all have a sense of UDL right now. I'm not going to go over that, but it's a framework, draws on the learning sciences and the goals to improve curriculum, instructional strategies, and better address learner variability. And this idea that the barriers to learning arise in the interaction between learners, their natural variability, and inflexible environments. So all of our sort of resource development is focused on how do we address things at that intersection. And I didn't go through last time in any detail the guidelines, but what's interesting here in the guidelines is you've got the three sort of principles, so you can look at it in this way, this sort of vertical way, and you can look at, a deepening in, from basic sort of options for perception, and then kind of building in the supports for symbols all the way to comprehension. So you can look at it kind of, a deepening down each principle, but you can also look at it as almost the first layer as hitting on some things around accessibility that are really, we see as very foundational to UDL, but increasingly we see that as, we like to partner in instances where people are thinking about that piece so that the work doesn't just stay at the level of accessibility, because it's not enough. This sort of kind of second layer of kind of how do we make information meaningful? So, how do we ensure that there's the kind of support for background knowledge so that the information is meaningful? And then finally, how do we sort of address the issue of kind of independent, self-directed learners? So learners who comprehend information and what it means to them, what it means for their kind of future career prospects. How are they have the support they need to have strong executive function so they can plan, they can organize, they can set their minds around a task and, finish it. And how do they sort of become self-regulated so that, both of their kind of emotional experience of learning is something that when a task is really hard or a course is difficult or they're bringing in background experiences that are challenging, how do we sort of design environments so we account for those things and make sure that we sort of leverage their strengths? So it's another way that we really look at the guidelines: accessibility, meaningful information, and independent, self-directed learners. So I'll just stop at this point and just say, before we sort of get into the site, are there any sort of thoughts or questions? I know last time I sort of blew through things really fast. Or ideas you want to share? Yeah.
Any thoughts on, because I see on my work constantly, I see this divide. When you show us the numbers on that study that showed the 87% against 19% of kind of imbalance in the accommodations and accessibility in university versus K-12. Do you have a kind of an opinion or
So the question is why, I just want to summarize properly, so, and you tell me if not, because I want to make sure that people who are listening to the headsets can understand. So the question is why are students, why are we aware of students that have disabilities in K to 12, and when those same students are in higher ed, we're not aware of who they are?
Well, no, my question is more around, I see that we in higher education are way slower to adopt any of these problems, or adopt solutions, and even in technology, like in blended learning. My peers, I'm a manager of the media lab, and I see all the kind of how few professors we have in universities coming to us to get help to and do innovative things in the classroom, while at the same time I have children in K to 12 that have teachers that are doing things way over what we are doing here at UNB or St. Thomas or McGill.
Yeah. I think what I would say is I think there's a bunch of reasons, and I bet other people could weigh in on this, but I think on the policy level, the onus in K to 12 is on the schools to identify and serve. If they don't, at least in the US, if they don't identify and serve, they're on the hook for a lawsuit. They're on the hook for a very, very expensive alternative because they can't provide a free and appropriate public education to students. So in higher ed, it changes. Under the Americans with Disability Act, there is still a requirement to serve all students, but the onus is on the student to advocate for themselves and identify and get, which is why I think some of the work that's being done around McGill, around changing the Office of My Access is, I think really the right direction to go in, because there are huge issues why students are not doing those things, or even when they go to inquire about accommodations, there's some work that's showing that they don't actually end up in the place in the classroom where they're picking up that accommodation because they're embarrassed, stigmatizing. They don't think their faculty members going to be receptive. And so I think part of what needs to happen is, if there's not a policy change, which I think is part of the issue, there needs to be a policy change as well, is a cultural shift. But I think in terms of the use of technology in education, I think increasingly we're seeing learning management systems and the things that are around that take on at least the accessibility side of things as not retrofits. When we talk to the software development companies, they're thinking about accessibility as foundational because, in part, they want a market advantage over someone else. So I think that's a huge issue, is how do you, A, make sure that you're only procuring technology that works for everyone, and then how do you start to build into your instructional design work much easier ways for faculty to do things like long descriptions, to do things like think about different forms of assessment. I think we're getting there. I think the software companies are going to push us in that direction, and a lot of the ones we talk to, they get it. They're doing this work. I think you're not going to be able to enforce that unless you have an institutional commitment at the highest levels. And what I would say is, I think it's important to start pulling in, deans, VPs, college, university presidents, and saying, we need a conversation about this because here's the relationship to retention. And you don't want to be the school that's only retaining 50% of your students. And maybe right now you're retaining 80% because you have a very selective admissions criteria, but the variability of your student body is growing. And unless you change your practices, you're not going to be retaining 80%, which I don't think anybody's actually doing that well. But I do think that you need both the approach from the access policies and the technologies in place that make it easier to support instructional design, and you need a kind of a very high level commitment to these practices. Yeah.
Sam, can you just announce that if anyone wants to ask a question, they need to come to a mic?
Okay, yeah, if anybody needs to ask a question, if you can come to a mic, that helps with translation. Okay. You want to look at the website a little bit and then, UDL on campus is, again, it's our sort of first pass at trying to articulate UDL in higher ed with additional resources and funding. Our goal will be to sort of start trying to find more practices from within institutions of higher education and aligning those to UDL as opposed to saying, here are best practices that aren't contextualized. We're really hearing from people they want specific examples, and that's what we want to show as practices. And we hope that it's a place where people sort of can say, oh, wow, I'm finding, here's this cool practice that's going on here. I'm going to reach out to those people and see about parallels in my setting or whatever. So we hope it's a place for people to exchange practices that are in institutions. But we basically took on 5 domains to try to sort of look at some of the system level issues. So of course, assessment, which we've talked about a little bit, institutional policies and practices. So those might be things like technology procurement policies, but they're also what are your legal obligations? And even if they're not the same in Canada, it's interesting to see what are legal obligations in the United States. And then what often happens is the Department of Justice, if a student raises a complaint or has a suit, like I'm blind and I was not able to access, this particular technology that was required in my course. They'll then take that to the Office of Civil Rights, Department of Justice. The Department of Justice will write a letter to the institution saying, here are the things you need to resolve. If you don't resolve these things, this is then going to go to litigation. Usually the institution then does whatever they need to resolve it. So it's definitely the stick approach as opposed to the carrot, but it's important so that we have sort of resources on that we try to update. What are, who's gotten one of these sort of Department of Justice letters and what have they tried to resolve, which is interesting to see what things people are trying to resolve. Then there's some stuff that's sort of a little bit more directed to maybe instructional designers or faculty, like stuff around planning your course. And then things around teaching approaches. So we have a piece in there around case-based learning because we think that some of these teaching approaches are really powerful approaches, but they haven't necessarily thought of universal design for learning. So if you think of like case-based learning, we still do a ton of cold calling in that method, which is great for some people, but for some people, cold calling on them in a course is really angst-provoking, and you're not going to get their best reflection on the material. There are also a lot of cases are handed out as big, huge print documents as opposed to documents that use technology in meaningful ways. So what we've tried to do is sort of with all of these resources, think about the 3 principles of UDL and how to apply them. And then there's then the big mothership is selecting media and technology. So what we've done there is we've really broken it down by every single type of technology. And so what I want to sort of show now is how we've sort of, these aren't perfect fits, but we've tried to organize some of the resources by the 3 principles in terms of how they fit best. So if you think of multiple means of representation, we have these resources around flexible media. And what we've tried to do is always sort of raise an issue and then try to provide a solution. And we have resources that are kind of broken down by the media type. So, if you're going to use audio, here's some things you need to think about. If you're going to use images, here's some things you need to think about. Text, video, different things. This is not a perfect pass at this at all, but at least it's like a stake in the ground. And what we're trying to do is get people to say, if I'm going to use videos in my courses, whether it's a blended course and the videos are available for students outside of the classroom, or I'm using these in the middle of my lectures, if I don't have captioning and transcripts, I really shouldn't be using that medium, or that's something I need to think about. So it's helping people to be planful ahead of time But there's also things about flexible media that if I'm in a technology procurement situation or I'm running a media lab like this gentleman back here, I can think about what kind of advising to give people around some of these things. Another area is in the representation arena, and this is not a perfect way of addressing this, but is in the area of voluntary product accessibility templates. And this resource actually links to another center we have, but an updated resource of who has voluntary product accessibility templates. So all the learning management systems will have one of these. What they are is they're documents that you can go into, and it'll explain what people are doing around accessibility. And we've sort of rated people as green, yellow, and red, which is not nice, but so what you have there is interesting to see, hey, you're thinking about using this technology in your classroom. First place to look is, does it have a VPAT? You know, the interesting thing with this is people are making connections that we didn't even expect them to. So last night I was talking about this dean of a college in Nebraska, and she was talking about the technology that they use in agriculture in the field to do things like, I'm so out of my depth here, but to do things like sort of look at how well how well hybrid forms of crops are performing. They basically take information as the machine is going out, and she's like, I don't know if the technology we have has VPATs, and all the information is visually represented. How do I make that work for someone that's not their strength? So people are making incredible connections in areas where they're using technologies that may not even be the technologies that we typically think of as, you know, education software that's bought whole hog by an institution, like the learning management systems. But just being aware of VPATs is important. They're not perfect. You know, an accessibility statement is not necessarily UDL, but they're a starting point. And what we've done here is we worked with someone who was in the University of California system, and we said, how do you explain to people what a VPAT is? Like, how do you fill one out? How do you look for things? So this resource actually sort of says, like, here's what a VPAT is, here's the parts of it, here's what you would need to sort of look for. And then under there, we also have something else that the same individual developed called an equally effective alternate access plan. And that's in certain instances, either because the knowledge you're trying to build requires it, or you may have a technology that for some reason does not work for all your learners, and you still have a very compelling reason to use it, and you need to use it. An equally effective alternate access plan is a way of being proactive about how you're going to make sure that you have an equally effective access plan for a student for whom that technology is not going to be effective. So in every situation, especially in environments where there's not an accessibility legally binding statement, you're going to have a need for some of these. And there may be sometimes a pedagogical reason that's so compelling that you do need to provide one of these. So those are some things that we have sort of around multiple means of representation. If we look at action and expression, we're doing a lot here around assessment. We're just cracking the surface, but we have two resources here around assessment that are hopefully helpful. One is around sort of the overarching, how do you think about assessment when you're thinking about universal design for learning at the same time? So what are, concepts like construct irrelevance? Like, how do you make sure that you're measuring what you want to measure? So if you're in a math class and your goal is to measure how well someone understands certain mathematical concepts, but the only thing you've offered them is very long descriptive word problems, you're actually measuring their reading ability, probably much more than you're measuring their understanding of math concepts. So how do we get people to think about UDL so that they're getting more accurate information about what students know? So with all of these things, when we tried to develop these resources, we've tried to kind of create the usefulness case And the accuracy of assessments is really a big issue here. There's also a resource around how to use the usage log information from your learning management system. So if you're a professor and you have, say, Moodle in your program, you have access to a bunch of information that tells you how your students are behaving in the course. It may be some embedded assessments you're getting information, who's completed the quizzes, how did they do, but it may be things like activities, logins. So how you design the information in your course actually has an impact on how much information you can get. So one simple example of that, what we've done is created a resource to help people at a very simple level figure out how to use that information to impact instruction, to figure out how well their course is serving students. So a very simple example is, say you have, in your learning management system, you get to create different pages. And say you have a page where you put all of your course, all the additional reading you want people to do on that single page. If you put all those things on that single page, you can't tell what resources people are going to and using, right? You have no idea, right? Because you're going to go to your learning management system and it's going to say, everybody clicked on this page. Well, you don't know if they want to know more about Shakespeare or they want to know more about James Joyce or whatever. But if you actually structure your pages so that you're putting different types of information on different pages, you then can go in and your management system is going to tell you information at a more close-grained level. And you can say, well, next year when I plan my course or next week when I plan my lesson, I'm not going to emphasize these things because no one's following that. Or it's a problem that people are missing this key information that I've sent them to. Is it an accessibility problem? Is the media presented in a way that only some students can get? Is the concept not well explained? Is it just a hard problem? So it lets, based on looking at students' behaviors, it lets people actually dig in deeper and see what's going on. And then another area of sort of action and expression is supporting web conferencing. So we had an individual on our team that is hearing impaired, and webcasts and web conferencing actually, without thoughtfulness, are actually terrible mediums for people for whom auditory processing is not great. It's kind of what the demands are. So this resource sort of says, if you're going to use web conferencing or webcasting, when to use one versus the other, what's the purpose, and how do you think about the 3 principles of UDL in that? So not just the representation stuff, but the kind of action expression. How do you create different ways for someone to interact, right, with that environment? How to respond. If you have a web conference and you're kind of treating that like a seminar course and the only way to respond is to press on your mic, that's not a great medium for someone. They can't participate in the discussion. And then what we've done some stuff around executive functioning skills. So we set that in the context of a fictional learner who's gone from face-to-face classes and all of a sudden is taking his first online class, and he's gone from getting a lot of teacher support and doing pretty well to all of a sudden there's all these things he's got to plan to do on his own, and it's sort of falling apart. What are some things in instruction we can think about ahead of time to make sure that doesn't fall apart? And the nice thing is good learning management systems have tons of supports now for executive function. They have your calendar right there. You can personalize things. They have, ways of setting reminders. But using those meaningfully with a educational goal in mind, which is supporting, students who have different types of strategies around planning and organizing their time, is really important for making sure that we leverage the power of the technologies that exist. Even things like making students much more aware of, hey, you've got a scheduler in this course and here's how to use it. You can imagine if they're in a face-to-face class, they hear someone else ask a question in class and all of a sudden they're like, oh, I need to be thinking about that deadline. I didn't remember I had it. They don't have that sometimes if they're taking part of their course online. And then on the engagement end, this one is sort of yet to be fully written, but that we have forthcoming some resources on social learning. What is it? What is this concept of distributed intelligence? how do we think about that? And then some work around case-based learning. How would we use that in a way that was UDL? And then more sort of basic pieces like we have, and this is from my colleagues, the other Sam at CAS, Sammy Daly and Gabby Schlickman, whose work is really around the linkage between emotion and cognition. And this is sort of how they've seen the interactions between emotion and learning, and sort of what variables are more variables that are at the individual level and that you can or potentially can impact, and what levels are more at the institutional level and how might you impact them. So there's sort of a graphic here that lays out some of these things that are often invisible to people, but that are incredibly present in our classes, and gives people a sense of what are the variables at play when we think about emotion and learning, and then to what degree are these things that we can impact, to what degree are these things that we can't. That's not all of the resources that are there, but we've sort of categorized some of them also around those kind of 5 domains, so you can see what's there. Let's kind of open it up now to sort of have a conversation about it, because this is really our first pass at thinking these are the things that are important. We want to, as I said, move more towards pulling practices from institutions. The other thing I didn't say that I meant to is that we've built this resource to try to model UDL as best we could. Now, it's not perfect, but every single resource is structured in the same way, where to support executive functioning, where there's sort of an abstract, a kind of overview, kind of core information, and then kind of summary part. So we've got sort of every single document follows the same structure. And then there is text-to-speech embedded in the site, so you could highlight over any piece of text and it would read it back to you. And then it uses responsive design, so it means depending on the device that you're on, the content reflows for that. So it's going to look different on your iPhone than it is on your desktop, so that if you're looking at some of this stuff when you don't have you're not sitting in front of your computer, you can still use the information. And the other thing, there's a lot of information on about how to improve the UDL-ness of open education resources. So if that's an area that's you've got sort of more growing interest in, I would start from kind of the ground up, making sure that you're looking at, we have some stuff on EPUB 3, which is the best format for at least open education resources that are textbook style. So there's some information about how you'd think of accessibility and UDL for open education resources. So let me open it up to ideas. People are browsing the site. Maybe they have some feedback.
Good morning, Dr. Johnson. My name is Roxanne Reeves, and Krista Wilkins and I were fortunate enough to be sent to the CAST Center for an online course 2 summers ago. And at that time, it was only K-12.
I know.
And I have to commend you and your team on all of the work that you've compiled for us. It is head and shoulders above what was there before for people at the post-secondary level. And just flipping through myself and being guided through by you has really opened up potential for me. We've been incorporating, we've drunk the Kool-Aid, and we're fully behind UDL as a learning pedagogy, and are striving to incorporate it into our classes. But it's been a bit of a struggle. We've had successes and failures, mostly successes, fortunately. But this has really altered, for me, how I can move forward with opening up my class even more. So please take that back to your team. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate that. And I will say one quick plug for the team that is absolutely an unbelievable group of individuals. I went into labor 3 weeks early. We were about to launch, and I went into labor. And so I basically, with the launch, was very busy with a baby. And we'd done a lot of work up to that point, but the people who sort of carried it through the finish line did so with, I was the project director, so did so with me gone. Was not so nice, but they did a fabulous job. The other thing I would say is I'm very glad it's useful, and we really did see the need for contextualized examples that people could say, okay, now I understand why this is a higher ed innovation, and I have concrete strategies. We're at the beginning. We need a lot more of that. So we need you all to help us contribute to saying what should UDL look like in higher ed, so that this resource is one that's powerful in terms of examples. But I'm a community practice person. I want it to be powerful in terms of networking, so people can say, I'm not an island in my institution trying this out. There's 4 other institutions I can connect with that are trying to take on the procurement policy issue, or trying to take on the flexible media issue, or whatever it might be.
Hi. Can you say more about collective intelligence? For me, it's a space of greatest dissonance between informal learning, where it seems like a dominant paradigm, and then the learning we do in compulsory schools and higher education. It feels like there's some systemic impediments to implementing it too. I think about how collective intelligence bumps up against assessment. What would UDL's response to that be? Or is there one that's articulated yet?
It's not well articulated yet. The idea of distributed intelligence, I think you're absolutely right. It's how we learn. It's how we learn. So I often think that in formal education settings, especially in face-to-face ones, I was just saying this for something in K-12, but we're often organizing what we do around behavior. So, teacher needs everybody to be quiet at the same time. That behavior is not necessarily conducive to, we're not organizing the way we do things around learning. We're organizing it around wanting people to behave in a certain way. I think the nice thing in terms of sort of increasing the use of networked technologies and the Fisher stuff around kind of end user design, thinking about pushing faculty to not 100% design their courses, or not just have assessments where they're individually giving feedback to every student, but students don't see one another's work. I worked, for example, my thesis work was on a professional development program in global mental health, where we're working to help people who are doing mental health care in pretty difficult post-conflict settings do better work. And we had a huge element of the work that was on self-care, because people have a lot of burnout and trauma. And we actually had everybody had to develop a multimedia product around self-care, how they take care of their own well-being. And first we let them sort of share that with a small group of people, like another 8 people, and talk about it and get feedback. And then we actually, at the end, created a gallery of everybody's there was 50 students in this a gallery of everyone's self-care videos. It's a very simple thing to do. It was incredible for letting people learn from their peers and see, how's my colleague in Kenya taking care of their burnout? How's this person who's working at a torture treatment center in the States working on their burnout? So I think that's the biggest area to push there is around assessment, and saying, how do you sort of give students opportunity to look at one another's work, and whether you're doing it formally or informally, to give one another opportunities to learn from and assess one another. I think there's a real place for the alliance between universal design for learning and communities of practice, because I always say it's like, a chain's only as strong as its weakest link. You can't have a good community of practice if not everybody in the environment has ways that they can perceive information available to them, ways that they can express what they know available to them, and some interest or thought about their motivational background, path, whatever. If you actually take those things seriously, your classroom can be an incredibly rich place where maybe your work even becomes easier as a professor, because you're not on the hook in the same way for making sure that every person people are learning from one another. And when I did this work, my thesis work, but our assumption initially was that everybody was going to love having these world experts in refugee mental health, and access to them was going to be so critical. It was critical, but much more critical was access to peers that were doing the work in different contexts and exchanging. Well, I'm at the local level. I really get what's culturally relevant. Okay, well, I have access to the best research right now about clinical treatment. How do we share those things? And I think it's that idea of sort of overlapping patterns of unique narrowness. Sounds sort of geeky, and showing a picture of fish is a bit weird, but I think the more we can orient faculty towards that, I think the more they can start to say, like, I actually can let my students be unique, and my goal is to help them at those intersection points so that they can make connections to how this person who's really good at X can help this person who's really good at Y learn even more. And I think the area to impact, other than having a well universally designed environment, is really saying, let's take assessment, let's look at assessment differently. It's not always measure at the level of the individual. Like, why don't we measure at the unit of the course and evaluate professors that way? How healthy was their environment for learning? So I don't have an answer. Yeah.
Sam, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now. It's a lot, and but I find it absolutely fascinating. One of the challenges we had in preparing for the symposium was to get people to come. And I'm happy to report that at the tail end, as I'm told is often the case, people signed up, but it's to get the word out to the target audience, which is instructors, faculty, that this is something to pay attention to. I think there's just so much noise out there about so many things, and how do we drive people to this as something valuable to them?
Well, you're all experts more than me. Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
One of the things that have helped us at Memorial is we have folks who are not in disability services that are champions for UDL, right? So it's not just coming from the disability folks, it's coming from different places across campus. And if you can get champions in each department, in each faculty, infect the faculty slowly, we found that really, really helps. But also, too, to have that administration and to have it not top down, you have to do this, although that really helps in the US, I know. I think having it on the radar of administrators so that they can have those high-level conversations, and it might be, again, like you said, retention, so it's not necessarily what happens in the classroom that an administrator necessarily cares about, but they do care about retention, and they do care about getting that money. And so that could be one way that it could be framed for an administrator, right?
Very helpful. Any other thoughts? Good for you to have the chance to talk to one another about this.
The other area, and I come from a polytechnic institution, and you had referred to it earlier in your previous presentation, is making that connection outside of the academic environments and the institutions and into real world relevance and where it applies. And I think that's where it'll take. And we move into those areas, and we move out a language of accommodation, but we move into just in creating equitable environments, but creative and innovative ways in those environments. And I think that helps to make the linkage and the relevance.
Mm-hmm. Important. Stop. Okay. You have one more? We let him one more.
In the line of what she was saying, but more interested in what are your thoughts on OERs. You talked about the importance of OERs to be in line with UDL,
but also I see that per se OERs and openness in general has a big benefit in the side of pedagogical benefits. And I wanted to know if you have any reflections about that, not just about the use of OERs, but and the alignment with UDL, but the benefits of openness, even in general.
Yeah, I think it's game changing. I really do. I think more than MOOCs, more than, I don't know, different things. I think open education resources, well done, have the capacity to provide access to content and curriculum in a way that lowers cost, which is a huge area, but I think in a way that improves teaching and learning because of the fact that people can remix, reuse, repurpose, so you can continue to iterate and improve on things. Discoverability is going to be a real problem, so there's some good work being done there on how do we sort of find the OERs that we want, how are they organized, the roles of media librarians if you're looking for a new job. That's a growth industry. But I do think that they're potentially transformative, and what I would love to see is the type of federally in the US right now, they've sort of invested in OERs at an incredibly high level. I mean, the fact that this $2 billion investment, but all sorts of other departments are, I'd love to see that same thing happen in Canada where people really say, this is game changing. They need to be well designed. They need to be reflective of good teaching and learning practices. But this is a way of creating more open access to higher education that's really essential. So. Thank you very much for giving me 2 hours of your time. I'm the youngest child. I never get that much time from anybody.